I finished off the lecture last week, and the sound apparently was horrible for the last couple of minutes. So I'm just going to go through some of the examples quickly again for those who have logged in remotely. We're asking the question about why can't we just take the Bible at face value? Now, it sounds wrong to say that you can't, doesn't it? It sounds wrong to say that you can't just take the Bible for what it says. We need to remember, of course, that the Bible is made up of all sorts of different genres. And just in the same way that I hope that you don't take everything I say literally, but you understand the spirit in which it's said, so we find parts in the Bible that are like that as well. So if I say, I've told you guys 1,000,000 times, context, context, context. Now, if anyone's been counting, they'll know it's not 1,000,000. It's just a figure of speech. And Paul does that often. He'll even use sarcasm as he deals with people and shows them how stupid their views are. We'll get to some of those later on. So on the one hand, we have to just remember that those sort of ways of speaking, using sarcasm, using hyperbole, I told you 1,000,000 times, those are natural ways of speaking. They always have been, and they're in the Bible as well. And so you can't say, oh, well, Paul says 1,000,000 times. Well, we don't do that. That's on the one side. The other side is that sometimes the writers of the epistles will say something that they understand perfectly clearly. Obviously, they're writing it. They know that their readers will understand it perfectly clearly. And so they don't bother to elaborate for us living 2,000 years later. They don't have us in mind as they write about these things. And I was talking about last week, this, that we have to sometimes, fortunately it's not in the majority of the cases, but there are some times where we find it very, very difficult to understand what has been said because we are not living in the first century. And so these were some of the examples that we looked at last week. 1 Corinthians 15. Now, if there's no resurrection, says Paul, if there's no resurrection, what will those do who are baptized for the dead? If the dead are not raised at all, well, why are people being baptized for them? Now, if you know the Mormon cult at all, the Mormons baptize for the dead. They literally do this. They take this verse literally and go and do it. They baptize for the dead. Don't ask me what it looks like, but they have a doctrine of baptism for the dead because of this. So what I'm saying is that how do you take that at face value? In your quiet time, you come across chapter 15, verse 29. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to put that into practice during the day? I see there's a question that's come up here. Let me just check it out. I think people are just saying that the sound is great, and I'm glad to hear that. Okay, what are we meant to do with a verse like that? And last week we said, we don't know. I gave you a couple of examples. You can go and look it up in a dictionary what baptism for the dead is. Go and look in the rest of the Bible to see where else people are baptizing for the dead. You won't find a single thing. It's the only time in the whole Bible that baptism for the dead is mentioned. And so now what do? The answer is nothing. You can't do anything. Until some archaeologist uncovers some documents describing what first century baptism for the dead was all about, and hopefully they do. I heard this week that something like only 4% of what is available to be found has been found in archaeological digs. So who knows what they're going to uncover. But until that day, we just don't know. It actually doesn't matter in this particular case because look at Paul's point. Look at the logic that he's using. He's saying, you guys live in a city. You guys live in the city of Corinth. And people are baptized for the dead in your city, aren't they? And they all say, yes, they are. He says, look, if the dead are not raised at all, in other words, if there's no resurrection for the dead, well, why do people go and baptize for the dead? Even the pagans out there, the ones doing the baptism for the dead, even they believe that the dead are actually alive, that there's an afterlife, that those people haven't gone forever. Why would they baptize for the dead if they really believe their loved ones didn't exist anywhere anymore? Even pagans believe that their loved ones still are alive somewhere. That's why they go and baptize for the dead. He says, now learn from them.
Sorry, and why do the Mormons reject?
Well, they've got more than just this wrong. So it's a cult. It's a completely false religion. Yeah. And they've got a whole Book of Mormon that goes along with their Bible, and their Book of Mormon tells them to do it, so they obey that. We'll get to a case that's a really good example to bring up later, when we all have things that we think are more important than the Bible. For them, it's the Book of Mormon. Where the Book of Mormon and the Bible clash, what will win the day? The Book of Mormon. The Catholic Church is the same. So when the Pope says something that clashes with the Bible, what will the good Catholic do? Believe the Pope. So they'll put the Pope above the Bible. Now the bad Catholic, who might be a Christian, will say, actually, no, I'm not going to listen to the Pope, but then he's a bad Catholic. So you can't be a good Catholic and be a Christian, but you can be a Christian if you're a bad Catholic. Now we're way off the subject. I don't know how we got there. Thanks. Okay. So Paul is saying, you guys, the point is this. These Christians in the church in Corinth had stopped believing in the resurrection of the dead. That led to all the problems that you read about in the rest of the book. They had stopped believing in the resurrection of the dead. And he says, but you guys are crazy. Even the pagans believe in, not the resurrection of the dead, but they believe in life after death. Look, they're baptizing. They're baptizing for their dead. Why have you guys stopped believing in the afterlife? Why have you guys stopped believing in the resurrection, actually, of the dead? So can you see it actually doesn't matter what this looked like? For us and our purposes, it doesn't matter what baptism for the dead looked like. And we don't have to do it in our churches. In fact, it's clearly a pagan practice that Paul's just using as an example to show that even the pagans are doing better at this point than the Christians, because at least they believe in the afterlife. Okay. There's another couple of examples. What about this one? For this reason, and because of the angels, the woman ought to have a sign of authority on her head. Right, ladies, so you go home and you read your Bible, and you come across this verse. What do you do with it?
What is a sign of authority?
Oh, there we go. Especially when you go and you think, well, I don't know what this means. I don't know what the sign of authority means. So I go and dig out my other Bible, and it says this. For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head. Now what are you going to do? Well, what about if you go further? The New Living Translation, for this reason and because the angels are watching, a woman should wear a covering on her head. So there's 3 different translations of the Bible who have all taken this Greek sentence, remember they're all translating from the Greek, and saying, what do we do with this? Some have said, well, it must mean a hat, so let's put down covering. Others have said a sign of authority, and they've left it up to you to decide what that sign of authority is. But can you see what I'm saying? There are difficult verses that unless you're going to follow the rules that we've been teaching you, like context, 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 about reading around the subject, finding out what the passage, the context of the whole passage is about, not just one verse, can you see you'll end up a Mormon in the previous example. You'll end up in this case saying, every woman from now on, if you want to be a member of my church, you wear a hat to church. Okay?
But how does it go from sign of authority to covering it? Everyone reads the NLT.
Well,
that sounds like there's something shameful about the
there is. Or more accurately, you see, if you've done your hard work, there was something very shameful about an uncovered head.
Then, but that's not necessarily why he's telling them to cover their head. Because he's not telling them to cover their head, according to that topic.
He says a woman ought to have some sign of authority on her head. Now, the NIV have left it hanging as to what that sign is. The NLT, the New Living Translation, said, well, we need to be a bit more helpful than the NIV. Let us decide what women should do. They ought to cover their heads. In other words, wear a veil, wear a hat. Now, that's taking a chance, telling women to do that.
Yeah, it's actually.
And we've got another question coming through here. Are you suggesting that baptism was common among pagans in Corinth? If so, what is our evidence? I don't know, Brooke. It does seem that baptism, this is going back to the previous verse, it does seem that certainly baptism for the dead was a common practice amongst pagans in Corinth. They were doing it, and Paul refers to them doing it. What it looked like, whether it was with water, I don't know. I know there is a cult. Well, it was a mystic religion where to be initiated into the religion, you had to be baptized in blood. It was quite common. And there are temples, again, I heard about that this week, the religion of Mithra, where you would stand in a pit, and a grate would be put over you, and a bull would be led over the grate, and then it would be slaughtered. And you would be drenched in its blood. And that would be your baptism into this cult. And so baptism doesn't necessarily have to mean water sprinkling. The pagan religions have been doing baptism for years. And they had to. In fact, they had to eat the raw meat. They had to eat something of that meat. And then you now remember, of this cult, of this mystic religion called Mithra. And there's a temple of Mithra in London, I believe. You can actually go and visit it. Still there. They're all around the world. There was actually a huge religion. And I don't know. There's a resurgence into these mystic religions around the world. The symbol is the bull. So on the floor you'll find a bull's head. Then you're dealing with Mithra, the religion called Mithra. Okay. So what do you do with a verse like this? What I'm saying is that this verse isn't enough to understand what to do and what's going on, right? You need to go back and read what the passage is all about. And especially when it comes to, and because of the angels are watching, what is going on here? To pick up Marge's point, was it shameful for a woman to have her head uncovered? Yes. Do you remember, well, I don't know if any of you were there, I wasn't, but I've seen photographs after the war, the Second World War, the women of Paris, the French women who had sided with the Germans, were marched through the city with shaven heads as a sign of utter humiliation and disgrace for not being patriotic, for being traitors, and usually giving sexual favors to the Germans, or feeding them, or taking them in, or being hospitable in any way, cooperating with the Germans. Once the war was over, these women were rounded up, had their heads shaved, and were marched to shame them through the city. It was a shameful thing. And in these days, the first century, an adulteress had her head shaved and marched through the city. And so can you see Paul saying, woman, why are you going to have your head shaved? Sorry? Yes? Yeah? So why, in other words, in those days, the shameful thing was to have your head shaved, or at least short hair. Prostitutes would show their availability by having head uncovered and short hair, even shaved hair. So Paul's saying to these Christian women, I know you might have done that. And there was a very, very strong women's lib movement in Corinth. That's where it all began, this new liberation from social norms. And he says, I know you might have been involved in that. I know you might have thought that it was, hip and happening to have short hair and to buck against the system. But now you're a Christian. Why do you want to stand up in church and read the Bible with your head uncovered? Why do you want to do that? That's a shameful thing to do. Everyone knows it's a shameful thing to do. So why are you doing it? Stop doing that. Now, what would be the equivalent today? Is short hair then, is short hair a problem for women? And our black ladies have got a big problem if that's the case. Okay? You have to all go and get braids. What is the symbol of shame today? Or what is considered to be risque today? Yeah, exactly. Skirts too short, tops too low, something that's putting you out there, drawing attention to yourself, showing that you've got this rebellious spirit. Paul says, why are you still doing that? You are now Christians. You have chosen to submit yourself to Christ's lordship. So stop being a rebel. Okay? A rebellious spirit has got no place in the church. You're under Christ's authority. You're under the authority of your elders. If you're a man, you're under authority. You're under the authority of Christ if you're the pastor. And if you're one of the members, you're under the authority of your elders or your council. Christians are people who are happy to be living under authority. Yes. Now, so the angels are watching. The NLT claims that the angels are watching. Now, neither of the other translations say that. They just say because of the angels. They've thought, NLT again, NLT you need to understand is a very loose translation. So they've said, well, I know the Greek says this, but no one can understand that. Angel, because of the angels. So let us help people see what's going on here, and we'll decide that it actually means the angels are watching. We know it says, cover your head, but we're going to, well, have a sign of authority on your head, but we're going to help women a little bit by saying, cover your head. So the angels, what have the angels got to do with this rebellious spirit, perhaps? How do you associate the word angel with rebel? Thank you. The fall. The fall. Why was Satan cast out of heaven? Because he rebelled against God. He refused to submit to authority. He wouldn't keep his place that God had given him. And so he was chucked out of heaven. And Paul's reminding, I think he's reminding the Corinthians of that. He says, even the angels know this. They know that if they rebel and refuse to submit, they will suffer the consequences. But you guys don't seem to know this. You guys are more stupid than angels, you know. The angels in heaven know their place. And those who refuse to keep their place, well, God casts them out. Yes. I don't actually, but Greek I do. Yeah. Well, we'd have to go and look it up. I don't have it here. I think the NIV won't be far wrong, and if anyone's got an ESV, it'll be very accurate. Okay, so you can look that up. Tell us what it says. So the question for those watching is, what does the Greek actually say? What is the accurate translation? What the ESV have done, they've tried to give us an accurate rendering of the Greek. Now, it's impossible to actually do that because it's unreadable if you do that. If you literally translate every Greek word into English, you can't read the English because in Greek, the word order doesn't matter. They'll put the subject at the end and the object in the beginning and the verb who knows where. So you can't actually do it. So the ESV have to do a little bit of shuffling, but they try and keep the translation as accurate as possible. The NIV are a bit looser than that. So they will try and give you, their big thing is that it's not a translation of the words, which the ESV is. The NIV is a translation of the ideas of the Greek. And then the New Living Translation or the Message or any of those, well, those are completely loose. They will take the Greek, they'll say, I know it says this, but we will tell people that it means that. It says this, and we say it means that. Now you're on shaky ground, aren't you?
So
yes, Mike.
In Greek, do they use the same word for head as in headship? Do they use that?
Yes, they do actually.
Like we do?
Yeah.
So that's why, because this is so confusing, those two terms. Because you could say, one would have a symbol of authority on her head, meaning a physical head, but on her husband.
Yes.
It's just said that he's her head.
Yeah.
So the symbol of authority is on him.
Yeah. So now you've got a word count. And in fact, in chapter, yeah, that's right.
So he's the authority figure, which then makes sense.
And well, I think in this case, he is saying cover your head. I think he's saying cover something over your head. Yeah, but he's not. I think he's saying if you refuse to put a covering on your head, in other words, if you insist on not wearing a veil in their context, then you are rebelling against your husband. You're acting as if you're not married. Because all married women wear veils in that context. And now you're refusing to wear a veil because you think, you know, and you're such a modern woman of the world. What are you saying to your husband? What are you saying about your husband that he's no good as a husband and you're available? What are you doing? Can you see what he's saying? He's saying there's no place for that sort of spirit. He's not advocating us wearing hats or veils in church today. And he never talks about this in any other letter to any other church except to this Greek church, where this was the custom. Have a look at while we're in chapter 11, have a look at what the NIV says about verse 3. I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man. Now, if someone's got an ESV, look it up for us as well. So the NIV says, chapter 11, verse 3. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3. I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ. The head of every woman is man. No. Okay, so the ESV have got it right. The ESV have said, no. That's not actually what the Greek says. What it's saying is, I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ. We all nod. Everyone happy with that? Christ is the head of every man. And that the head of now every woman is man? No. I'm afraid I'm not your head. I'm not an elder in this church, and you're not a member of this church anyway, and you're not my wife, so I'm not your head. If you are married, your husband is your head. If you're not married, well, your elders are your head, or your father is your head. But don't look to me to be your head. But that's what the NIV is saying. The head of the woman is man. But actually, the ESV have got it right. The head of the wife is the husband. Woman, if you have chosen to get married, you have chosen to submit yourself to your husband as your head. That's what you promise in your vows. Okay? And the husband is to be a head to the wife, like Christ is a head to the church. He is to sacrifice himself for her. That's what the husband's role is. Yeah.
Is that why it's written, "Thou shalt not be yoked to an unbeliever"?
Yes. How can you ask? So the question is being yoked to an unbeliever. That's exactly what right. Why choose a non-Christian to be your head, woman? Why would you do that? You're going to ask a non-Christian to be your husband, to be your head, to lead you to Christ, to prepare you for the day you're going to stand face to face with him. You're asking an unbeliever to do that? How can he do that? You're asking him something impossible. You're really not being fair on him. Because the husband's job, we are told, is to prepare his wife, to be a radiant bride, to prepare her for Christ, to seek her good, to nurture her. And now you're going to ask an unbeliever to try and do that for you? It's impossible. He doesn't care about Christ. That's why he's not a believer. Okay. So can you see, remember what we're doing here? We're a little bit off of what we're trying to do, New Testament epistles and all that. We're trying to say that sometimes, well, at all times we need to be careful, and sometimes we have to be especially careful when we come across the odd verse like this, which they're not ununderstandable, impossible to understand, but they require a little bit more hard work than just reading it like the newspaper. Got another question here. I'm not surprised. Where do you buy hats for church? You could make quite a trade, couldn't you, selling hats at the door? Brooke, how do we understand these verses in the context of our gender-sensitive generation? And there's actually another one before that I missed. The Old Apostolic Church, this is Gillian, the Old Apostolic Church of South Africa took this out of context. They believe that it is how you get to heaven through a male head. Well, there we go. That's the Old Apostolic Church. Yeah. Yeah, well, you wonder, hey? You wonder. Well, we've got tons of questions. Let me just, I don't want to spend too much more time on this, but Brooke's last question, how do we understand these verses in the context of our gender-sensitive generation, is a very good question, isn't it? Because, number one, it's gender-sensitive, and number two, it's more than just we want equality between the sexes. Certainly in places like Australia, the women want to be top dog. You know, we even talk about who wears the pants in the home. Paul would be saying, you know, why do you want to wear the pants in the home? Women, why do you want to wear your head uncovered? It's the same, it's that kind of figure of speech that he's using. So it's very relevant, isn't it, in our gender-sensitive generation. I think he would have, because he advocates freedom for women. And he says to women, in chapter 7, I think, he says to widows, he says, you can choose if you want to get remarried, but you can't choose who you remarry. You must marry a believer, but if you want to, you can remarry. Now that was a bombshell to drop in the 1st century. And there were. You look at the thanks that he gives at the end of the letters, there's long lists of women in Paul's, that have partnered Paul in ministry. They've been real strength of his ministry. But to say that a woman can choose if she wants to get remarried was unacceptable in that culture. So he would have been fighting for women's rights, but not women's headship, because that's against the created order of things. We have to leave it there, I'm afraid. I know there's probably tons more questions. But let's just keep going. I know. Let's see what that was. I want to be fair to those who aren't sitting here. The question is connected to the preceding verse, chapter 11, verse 10. So a woman should wear a covering on her head as a sign of authority because the angels are watching. I think we've covered that. So he's using the angels as an example of a case where people were happy to submit to authority. Here, these women are not happy to submit to authority. He's saying, guys, learn from the angels. I think so. Yeah. But we won't go there right now. What about this one? We're still on the women's issue. Well, we'll go there now. The woman will be saved through childbearing. Yeah. Etc., etc. There's more to it than that. But what I'm saying is that taking the Bible at face value, I often come across people say, you know, you've gone and studied for 3 years at varsity to be a pastor. Why don't you just read the Bible and pray, and God will help you understand? And well, that's not wrong. You should read the Bible and pray, and God will help you to understand. But if you're going to be a Bible teacher, if that's going to be your profession, well, you know, it's like saying to a pilot, why don't you just, you know, just jump behind in the cockpit and see how things go, you know. You'll learn on the job. Your co-pilot will help you. And we're saying, hang on a second, this is really serious. You can lead a whole generation to hell if you don't get the Bible right. So here's a verse. If you just say, well, women will be saved through childbearing. I bet you I could start a cult that believe that women will be saved through childbearing. Will they? Well, it says they will. So how can you say no? It says women will be saved through childbearing. Here's some of the questions that jump in my mind. What about faith? The whole way through Paul's letters, he keeps talking about faith is the way you're saved. And our response to what Christ has done is repentance. We must repent and believe. Every sermon in the book of Acts ends with repent and believe. Okay? Where's that? Childbearing. Is that a substitute for faith and repentance? What about this? Will monkeys be saved through childbearing? And if not, why not? If childbearing is the way people or creatures are saved, well, what about monkeys and cows, for that matter? It doesn't say much, but why not, is my point. What about men? Tough luck. So maybe the Amazonians are right. Okay? But can you see all of these questions need to be answered? What about unmarried women? What about women who can't fall pregnant? Can they not go to heaven? You see, so there's got to be more to it than that. So when we read the context, and when we understand the context, and you remember we had said earlier, you must put yourself in the shoes of the readers. Those letters were written for them. They were real letters written to real people who really understood what Paul was writing. The problem is not that Paul was stupid and didn't write clearly enough. He wasn't either of those things. The problem is we are so far detached from that first century that the onus is on us to not be satisfied with ignorance. We have to dig deep, especially if you want to be a Bible teacher of sorts. You need to dig deep. Find out what life was like in Corinth. Find out what life was like on Crete. Find out in Ephesus where Timothy was working. And when we do start digging out around, I think we get our answer to this, where women were told that they need to turn their backs on family life. If you want to be a truly spiritual woman, you won't get married. And you won't get involved in the messy business of children and caring for a husband. And that really is for the unbeliever. A Christian woman, a truly devout Christian woman, won't get involved in that. And Paul is writing against that view. Can you see? And he's saying that he's not saying that here is a doctrine of salvation. You must have a child, and then you can go to heaven. That's not what he's saying. He can't believe that we're even thinking that. And none of the readers would have understood him to be saying that. But what we need to understand is what was he writing against? He's writing against the view that was teaching the women that they're not allowed to get married, they're not allowed to have children, not allowed to get involved in the messy business of life. The way to get to heaven is to rise above all of that. Rise above that. I actually know a guy who used to come to this church and has fallen away and joined a cult, who has stopped working. I bumped into him in the supermarket this last week, and he says, I've actually stopped working because I'm waiting for Jesus to come back. And I'm just spending my time praying and reading, and I'm not working anymore. I said, how are you feeding yourself? He's a single guy, so he doesn't have kids and all that, but he's rented out some of the rooms in his house so that he gets a little bit of money in to buy food. But he's risen above work and all the stuff that's worldly, like work and kids and bums and feeding your husband and ironing, and you rise above all that stuff. That's very this worldly way to live. Get spiritual. Spend your time fasting and praying and meditating. And that should have been the view. And so Paul is writing against that view and saying, no. There's nothing wrong with women bearing children. How do you think you came into this world if it wasn't through a mother? That's this kind of point that he's making. Another question. Wow. What's the cult called? Brooke again. 1 Corinthians, he's back in 1 Corinthians 11. A man was not made for woman's benefit, but woman was made for man's benefit. And so Brooke's right. The other thing Paul's appealing to there is the whole created order. That women, as they were doing in Corinth, mustn't buck against the created order. God has built order into his creation. There is headship in his creation. There's even headship in the Trinity. There's order in the Trinity itself. The Father sends the Son sends the Spirit. And the Spirit and the Son never buck against that. They are quite content with their role, completely equal in every way, but each member of the Trinity having different roles. And that, God says, must play itself out in your local church, and it should play itself out in the family as well. Husband and wife are completely equal. Eve was created as a helper for Adam, not a servant to Adam, but different roles in that relationship. The man must fulfill this role, the woman must fulfill that role. Is simply what God is saying. He wants the pattern in heaven reflected in the church and reflected in the family. That's what he's saying. And these women in Corinth were not content for that pattern. They wanted to assert themselves and express their liberation from all of that. What about another one? Women. Sure, I'm really into the women's case today. Women should remain silent in the churches. Well, there we go. I could start another church that has, hands out, not hats at the door, but gags. Husbands, gag your wives as you come in here, because we want silence from the women in this place. That's not going to work in CCU. Number one, we're completely outnumbered by the women. So I think I know who will end up wearing the gags. But what do you do when you're reading your Bible and you come across a verse like that? If you're not prepared to do a bit of hard work, a bit of reading around, a bit of thinking, well, you will end up with a cult that says women are not allowed to speak in church. And as for reading the Bible in the church, well, heaven forbid. We're never going to allow that. As one church I was in, wouldn't even allow women to read the Bible or do anything because of this verse. So what do we do with that? Especially when we do a little bit of reading and we come across other passages of the Bible. A well-known prophecy from Joel. I will pour out my spirit on all people, your sons and your daughters. There we are. Women will prophesy. So women will speak the words of God. What about when I'm reading in Acts? We've already done this passage in our morning devotions. Even on my servants, both men and women, is the way Luke quotes from Joel. Men and women will prophesy. So there's plenty of places where it's said that women won't be silent. Acts 21, leaving the next day, we reached Caesarea and staying at the house of Philip the evangelist, one of the 7. He had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. Another case of women speaking ministry in the context of ministry, speaking, not being silent. So what do we do with passages like this? In chapter 11, we've already looked at it, haven't we? That a woman should not pray or prophesy with her head uncovered. It's not that women should not pray or prophesy. And he's talking about the gathered church, the church gathering, the Sunday service. He's talking about that meeting, and he's saying women mustn't pray or prophesy at that meeting when their heads are uncovered. He's quite happy for them to pray and prophesy in chapter 11, but in chapter 14 he's saying, women must remain silent. What is going on here? Clearly a contradiction. You can't trust anything the Bible says. Look how they got it so wrong, and that's how the unbeliever goes off about this. Well, you could need to do a bit of work. And you'll find out that what chapter 14 is all about, and we won't do that now because we don't want to spend too much more time on this, is orderly worship. Paul wants order in the church. And what seems to be happening was that there were domestic affairs being brought into the church and raised in the church meeting. And he's saying to him, if you've got a problem with your husband, sort it out before you come to church. He says earlier, if you're hungry at home, eat before you come and have the Lord's Supper. Don't make a glutton of yourself at the Lord's Supper. Eating and getting drunk at the Lord's Supper, which in those days was a supper. It wasn't a little piece of bread and a little glass of juice. It was a meal. He says, if you're hungry, eat at home. So you don't eat all the food when you come to church. Yeah.
If you look at the context, in terms of the societal context with the Jews, in terms of that they don't come, does not relate to that time period?
That Paul would be agreeing with the Jews? I don't think so, because number one, this is written to Gentile church. It had Jews in it, but it was predominantly a Greek church in Corinth. And I think he, of all people, is pro-woman. So often you hear that Paul was anti-woman, but that's utter rubbish. You don't have to read more than 10 minutes of his letters to see that he's pro-woman. And he's already in this letter, he stood up for women, saying that they must choose, they must have the say about whether they get married or not, etc. It was going completely against the culture of the day, completely against the culture. He's the one who breaks the mold and gives women the freedom to choose whether they should marry or not. So I don't think he's reinforcing an old custom here. I don't think so. I think he's talking about a very real issue in this church, which was complete disorder at the church meeting. It was chaos. There was prophecy, there was tongues, there was women fighting with their husbands, there was all sorts of rubbish going on at church. It was a complete disgrace, and they were the laughing stock of the city. And he's trying to sort this church out through this letter. Okay. Here's a good one. 1 Peter 3. You don't have to turn there. Well, it's up on the screen in front of you. See if you believe or agree with this statement. For Christ died for sins once for all. So far, so good? Okay. The righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive by the Spirit. All happy? You all think, yeah, no, I shouldn't be. But so far, you should be. Yeah. Let me put you at ease. Christ died for once and for all. The righteous in the place of the unrighteous. He took our place, swapped places with us to bring us to God. He was put to death in the body, that is true, but made alive by the Spirit. And here comes my problem. Through also he went and preached to the spirits in prison. Now I'm thinking, I don't know what's going on anymore. Any of you know what that means off the top of your heads? Well, that's certainly one of the options that people have said. There are about 6 different views on this, on what this verse means. The one says that those 3 days that he was in the grave, he was in hell, preaching to the spirits. But I don't know why he would do that, because they're in hell after all, and they can't repent. Jesus preaches when there's a chance for people to repent, and people in hell, well, they're in hell, aren't they? So, and the other thing is, our Apostles' Creed, our translation of the Apostles' Creed has been very unhelpful. The Apostles' Creed originally was translated into Latin, and they made a mess of it. And so some of you will know the Apostles' Creed to be saying, he died, was buried, and, what does it say? I've forgotten now. And descended into hell. That's right. He died and was buried and descended into hell, and after 3 days he rose again. That is very unhelpful. Did he die? Yes. Was he buried? Did he descend into hell? Where does the Bible teach that he descended into hell? Some people have said this is the verse that teaches that Jesus descended to hell, but is that really enough, it's the only place where it talks about, and besides it's prison, it's not hell. It doesn't say hell, it talks about prison. And so actually what the original Apostles' Creed said, he died, was buried, and was put into a grave. He was put into the ground. In other words, he was really, really, really dead. For 3 days he was buried. And 3 days was the time that was required for someone to be declared dead. Which is kind of, you need to get a doctor to sign a death certificate. And he'll check if there's brain activity. If there's no brain activity today, he will sign a death certificate. There's certain vital signs he looks for. Well, there were no, EEGs or CGs or whatever. So the way the Jews believed was that if you were dead for 3 days, you were dead. I was just going to say, Lazarus is the classic example. After 3 days, Jesus delays his trip so that he can get there after 3 days to prove that Lazarus wasn't just in a coma. Lazarus hadn't fainted. He wasn't in a coma. 3 days later, Lazarus is still dead. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that he's dead. And smelly. And smelly. And Lord, he stinketh. This is the King James Version. 3 days. So Jesus died, was buried in the ground for 3 days, is what the Apostles' Creed is saying. It's not talking about hell at all. In fact, in our church, we've changed the words to be on the cross, he descended into hell. In other words, on the cross, he suffered hell. On the cross, the wrath of God was poured out on him. He went through everything that you go through in hell, he went through on the cross. That was where his victory was won. So what is this all about? Well, wherever else have you heard the word prison? Does that ring a bell? Paul's in prison, yeah? Somewhere in the Old Testament? Isaiah. Nearly there. You would have got there. But Isaiah talks about this king that God's going to raise up, who is going to make the lame leap, the blind see. He's going to preach to those in prison. Okay? And it's a long, complicated, it's very complicated. You can go and read it. There's a great article by Tony Payne on this verse. Tony Payne from St. Matthias Media, which I can give you if you're interested. And he reckons what he's talking about, he's talking to, because it's also in the days of Noah. This is how this verse goes on. And he's saying, well, actually, to what Peter's doing here is referring back to the prophecy in Isaiah, where Jesus would have died, was buried, was raised back to life, made alive by the Spirit, and then he went to all those Old Testament saints, like Noah, and the believers in the Old Testament who were in the grave waiting for the Messiah to come, and said, okay, it's time to get up. I've done it. What Isaiah prophesied would happen has happened, and you are now released to come to heaven. Now, is that satisfactory? You can decide. But the point is, there's some really tough verses that need a little bit of thinking and a bit of hard work and a bit of knowledge of the Old Testament to shed some light on it. What have we got here? I missed the question on Timothy, the woman saved by childbearing. Paul is strongly arguing that women should be silent. Yes, and he is. He says that. But we must remember the context. It's where the women were disrupting the meetings. Because Paul is happy with women to be preaching and prophesying, praying and prophesying aloud in the earlier chapters. But it's this disruptive element. Domestic disputes, I think, is what's coming into the church in chapter 11. But we would have to spend a lot more time looking at that, which we don't really want to do right now. Okay. Another one. Have I got one more on your notes? 2 Thessalonians. Again, Don't let anyone deceive you in any way. For that day, now 2 Thessalonians, you need to know what that day means. In 2 Thessalonians, he's talking about the return of Jesus. And it's all about the end times and how the Christians in Thessalonica were panicking because false teachers had come in and told them that they'd missed the second coming and that they'd been left behind and that all their loved ones who were Christians, somehow had missed the resurrection of the dead. And so Paul's writing Thessalonians to them saying, look, relax, Jesus hasn't come back yet. You guys are all right. Just keep believing, keep repenting. He says, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. Now, forests have been cut down to provide the paper for the books that have been written about the man of lawlessness and the Antichrist and who this is. And is he a guy with a turban from the Middle East, as I've heard often? Is someone coming from the Middle East with a turban? You must watch out for him. Don't follow him. He's the man of lawlessness. Again, what does that mean? Do you remember, I don't mean to completely shatter your faith in the Bible or in your ability to understand the Bible. These are the hardest verses I can find to prove a point that you need to engage your brain when you're reading the Bible. It's not a nursery story. It's not Shrek, where you can follow it and miss a bit and come back. And the Bible requires some serious thinking as you read it, and especially if you're going to teach it. So again, this man of lawlessness requires some hard work. And you need to find other cross-references to this. He's not talking about the Antichrist here, because he would mention the Antichrist if he were. He talks about Satan a little bit later in the same chapter. And I personally think he's talking about not a particular man, but this lawless rebellion against God, a generation that has no regard for God's law. They are not God-fearers at all. Again, my particular view, you can work out what you think. But the point is quite clear. He says, don't be deceived. The day will not come until, this rebellion has been squashed. So don't worry, the day hasn't come yet. That's his point. Don't get tied up in the man of lawlessness and end up, spending your whole life preaching about a man of lawlessness. Preach about waiting patiently, faithfully for Jesus. Because the day is coming when he is going to come back. And then all rebellion will be crushed. And those who have rebelled, who have been lawless, will be doomed to destruction. That day is coming, so be warned. Be careful how you live until that day. You see that that's where the stress of the paragraph is. Waiting for the day, not on the signs of the end. Paul just mentions this in passing. So it's obviously quite clear to them because he had been there. He had been in Thessalonica. He had taught them. They'd spoken about this before. He's just referring to it in casual conversation. His point is, don't worry, the day hasn't come yet. The day hasn't come yet. You haven't missed anything because the day is still coming. And on that day, be warned. Don't you be caught up with this man of lawlessness or the ways of lawless people, because you will also be destroyed. Okay. Now we can get back to our principles that we're trying to teach you. That was meant to be fun. I don't know if it really was. It's more like sweat and hard work. Okay. And again, what time do we finish here again? 15:15. 15:15. We've got 15 minutes. Great. So, how do we go about working out the meanings, not only of these hard verses, and they are hard, but the easier ones as well, all verses? How do we do it? Well, we've got to understand the historical context. Understand the historical context. Understand the setting that Paul is writing into when he writes his epistles. Which author are we talking about? Because remember, more than Paul wrote, not only Paul wrote epistles. We've got epistles or letters from Peter and from John. 1 and 2 Peter, 1 and 2, 3 John. We've got Paul. What's the other one? What's the other epistle we've got? Paul wrote those. He wrote that. Hebrews. Hebrews is an epistle. It calls itself an epistle. It is a letter. We just don't know who wrote it. I don't know. I'm happy with Paul writing that. But we can't say he did because it never ever quotes him. He never puts his name to it. The point is, which of those different authors wrote the letter you're busy reading? It will affect how you read it, won't it? We've already mentioned this, I think. Peter was the guy who was, on the Mount of Transfiguration. For that matter, so was John. Peter and John, and they both wrote epistles. And you might find references to that huge event when Jesus' glory was revealed in their letters. And certainly in Peter you do. We heard the voice from on high, says Peter, when Jesus was transfigured, when he was glorified. So which author wrote the letter? And knowing a little bit about that author will explain what he says in the letter. So Peter refers to that incident because that was like, welded, burned into his memory. I don't think he ever forgot the day he saw Jesus unveiled. Paul will write about another day. He'll write about the day when he met Christ on the road to Damascus. And that would have been stuck in Paul's brain. The day that he met the risen Jesus face to face. And he refers to that in Galatians. When he says, I received what I'm saying, not from man, but from Jesus himself. I'm no less an apostle because I never saw Jesus face to face, because I actually did. In the spirit on the road to Damascus, Jesus appeared to me. Paul will talk all about the days that in Timothy, he writes about how he was the worst of sinners because he persecuted the church. And he was responsible for the death of Christians. And that is burned into his memory. And he's incredibly ashamed of that. And so you can find these nuances in the letters. Knowing a little bit about the author really helps to just give you a bit of background to the letter. What about the readers? We've mentioned a little bit about this. Put yourself in the shoes, the sandals of the readers when you read the letters. Women will be saved through childbearing. We immediately think, wow, some antenatal clinic in some fancy hospital, childbearing, giving birth. He's not talking about that. He's talking more than just childbearing. He's talking about family life. Women can just as easily be saved if they're running families as if they're not. This was his point there. So which readers, is he writing to Timothy, who needs encouragement, or Titus? Or is he writing to one church, a specific church? Or is he writing to a whole province of churches like Galatia, the book of Galatians, letter of Galatians, written to a whole bunch of churches? What about this one? When we think about the reader, here's a very famous verse. Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with him and he with me. Now, how have you heard this verse used? Or where have you heard this verse used? Okay. Exactly. So Jesus is at the door of your heart. He's knocking. He wants to come in. If you'll open that door, he will come in and eat with you, and he with him, and you with him. You will become part of his family. So please, won't you open the door and let Jesus in? It's an invitation to become a Christian kind of verse, isn't it? Except that's completely wrong. Because when we think that, we've forgotten who the reader was. Who is the reader of this book, Revelation? Who was the book written to? Churches, Christians. So why do Christians have to open their hearts and let Jesus come in before he'll eat with them? They've already done that, haven't they? That's how they became a Christian. So can you see, suddenly, this verse isn't written to non-believers, begging them to become Christians. It's a verse written to Christians. Now I've got to rethink everything I believe about that verse and the whole meaning of that verse. And how am I going to understand that? Well, I need to go back and read the whole chapter, don't I? And find out what else he's saying to these same hearers. Because if you know anything about Revelation, he writes in these early chapters to one church after another. And each church gets a specific message from the Apostle John. And to this church, they need to hear this, and so he tells them that. That church are doing pretty well, but under massive persecution, so he gives them encouragement. The next church, well, they started off well, but they're not doing so good at the moment. So he tells them what they need to back up, and so on. And so now you need to work out which church is he writing to here, and why do these Christians need to be told to open the door to Jesus? It's certainly not, whatever else it means, it's not so that they can become Christians. They are Christians. So there must be something else going on. And then I can go back and work that out before I go and teach it and use it possibly out of context. Most likely out of context. What about this one? Hebrews 2. Again, the key to understanding a verse like this is going to be the reader. Put yourself in the shoes of the reader before you try and work out what it means. We must pay more careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard so that we do not drift away. Now, if I come and preach that on a Sunday here, or if I come to you after church on a Sunday and say, listen, I think you should pay more careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, maybe in the sermon, so that you don't drift away. What are you thinking? What do you think? What do you think that I'm worried about in your life? That you're going to drift away. Drift away where to? Away from Christ, away from the church. So that's away from and towards where? The devil, or atheism, or materialism, worldliness. Well, wherever you came from, you're going to drift away from Jesus, away from the church, and you're going to go and become worldly. That's what. If you came and said that to me, that's what I would think. Okay, now he or she is worried that I'm backsliding, and I'm going to give up my salvation, and I'm going to, become a materialist, a child of my age. But can that be what this verse means? It can't if you know who the readers are. And who are the readers? They're Jews. They're Christians. It's a letter written to Christians. But what sort of Christians? Christians who come from Jewish families. They were once Jews, like Paul, who had now become Christians. So when the author says to them, I'm worried that you're going to drift away if you don't pay careful attention to what you've heard, the gospel, I'm worried you're going to drift away. Where's he worried about them drifting towards? Back into Jewish religion. Exactly. And the whole book is about that, isn't it? When you go and read it. It's all about, guys, you've got Jesus. You don't have to go back to what you used to worship. You don't have to go back to the worship of angels, which the Jews used to do in chapter 1 and 2. Don't go and worship angels. You've got Jesus. Festivals and keeping this day and keeping that law, you've got Jesus. The whole book is about that. Guys, you've got the high priest himself. He is Jesus. Don't go back to human priests. Why would you do that when you've got the real deal? So can you see this? The author, if it's Paul, he's not at all worried that these guys are going to become materialistic or atheists. There's no chance they would ever become atheists. The chance is very strong that it'll be too hard for them to stay a Christian from the persecution, from being ostracized by their families. It'll just become too hard, and they'll just give in and do what their families want and go back to the synagogue and get on with being Jews. That's what he's really worried about for them. So now, how would I preach it to my people? Well, instead of legalism, you're on the right track, I think. What would they be substituting? What would these people be substituting for Jesus? Law would be more general. What did you say? Rituals, sacrifice. How do you describe all that stuff? Rituals, laws, sacrifices, priests, religion. You start trusting in your old religion, or a new religion, but you're trusting in stuff you do for God to get you to heaven. So I mustn't use this verse when I stand up on a Sunday and say, guys, Gateway is from the devil. I don't want to catch any Christians in Gateway. You must never buy a new car. Don't become materialists. Don't go the way of the world. Because that's not what this verse is saying. This verse is saying, guys, don't think being religious is going to help you with God. Don't think that by taking communion and getting baptized and giving money and going to a Bible study that you're going to get to heaven. That's how I apply this verse accurately, without taking it out of context. Once I've remembered who the readers are for this verse, he's warning them of the danger of becoming religious and thinking that God is impressed with religion. That's what he's warning them about, and that's what I must warn my people or my children or my teenagers about. That religion is the opposite of Christianity. It's the opposite of the gospel. Mm. Yeah. So they would completely become outcasts from your family if you were a Jew. And that's true today. I believe that, what would he be? The guy in charge of the synagogue, rabbi. My aunt and uncle used to live in Port Shepstone, and they got to know the rabbi quite well. And he became a Christian, and his family held a funeral for him. They counted him dead from that day onwards. They had a funeral, and they counted him dead. As far as they were concerned, he had died. That's today. So can you see the pressure on the early Christians, or the early Jews who had become Christians, the pressure to go back and to say, look, and the family would have been saying, we'll have you back, come back. What's wrong with our religion, It served us for thousands of years. We are the people of God. We've got the promises of God. We've got the temple. We've got the law. We've got the priests. And you turn your back on all that? You see how the Christians would have been tempted to go back. People saying, don't go back. You've got Jesus. That stuff is religion. Don't go back to religion. God isn't impressed with religion. Religion is the opposite of faith. Religion is trusting what you can do for God. You must trust in what God has done for you. He has given you Jesus. Paul, or that guy. I don't know, actually. But we've got a minister in PE, Glenn Lyons, a church being a minister who was from a very strong Jewish family. All his brothers are staunch Jews, and the whole family is Jewish, and he's a Christian. How he heard the gospel, I don't know. He's a great preacher, great preacher. Someone like you bothered to share it with them, I guess. God uses Christians. Yeah. Yeah. So which author wrote, which reader wrote, what sort of neighborhood is he writing into? That's strongly tied to the reader, isn't it? Is it an idol-worshipping city like Athens? When Paul was in Athens, he walks around and he sees all these idols and he nearly freaks out. So he tells them about the unknown God that they don't know. Is it Corinth, which is a very pagan, very cosmopolitan, very modern city full of modern ideas and women's liberation and all of these things? Or is it into a different setting, Crete? When he writes to Titus, is it? I think Titus is on the island of Crete. And Paul writes to them, Cretans are brutes and gluttons. Even your own poets say that. He says, I didn't say that. You describe yourselves. Cretans are gluttons and liars and brutes. And so, I think we even say that today. Don't be a Cretan. It's a derogatory term to be referred to as a Cretan. Yeah. But the point is, some of those Cretans had become Christians. It was a barbaric little island. It was tribal warfare on the island, very much like what we still find in some places. The headhunters, that sort of idea. You go marching over the hill and you beat up the guys, and that's how they march over tomorrow and beat you up. And now some of these guys have become Christians. They've heard and believed the gospel, and now can you imagine when a guy from that side of the hill and a guy from this side of the hill arrive at church together? So now I'm going to read the letter to Titus. And poor old Titus is left on the island to try and be the preacher and the pastor of this bunch. Liars, drunkards, evil brutes, and there's poor old Titus, he's their pastor. And so Paul writes the letter to Titus. Go and reread it in that light. And suddenly it'll come alive, you see. And it's just doing a little bit of work on the background to the letter. What sort of church is it? Is it a church that's trying really hard, but are finding it really tough going? I'm thinking of Philippians, the church in Philippi, who were doing really well. Paul has nothing but praise for them. There's this little issue with these two women, Judea and Syntyche, but apart from that, the letter is just a glowing report about how they are doing. He's just saying, basically, keep doing what you're doing, guys. Don't give up. You're doing so well. Keep believing, keep trusting, keep loving one another, keep partnering with the apostles of the gospel. You're doing great. Or is it a letter to Corinth where it's just such a mess, he doesn't know where to begin. He doesn't know how things got so bad so quickly. He was there a little while before, and now all these reports have flooded into him about how this church has gone completely off the rails. And he's got to write the letter to them saying, guys, do you want me to come with a stick? Because I'll come with a stick if you want me to. But I'm writing this letter first, so that maybe you'll listen to me and I won't need to come with a stick. It was just, everything about Corinth was completely wrong. Everything. There's almost no good things in that whole letter about those Christians in Corinth. Or is it a letter like Galatians, where it's even worse than Corinth? It's not just that their behavior is shocking, and they're making an absolute mockery of the name of Jesus. And the churches in Galatia had actually given up the gospel and had started following a different gospel. And so you need to know a little bit about what is the setting? What is the setting? What sort of church are we dealing with here? A healthy church, a sick church, or a church that's turned its back on the gospel? Let's see how we go here. So that's just the historical context. Do a little bit of work on the history. Now, the literary context. Looking at the words. What does it say? What do the words say? And how does Paul say what he says? What do the words say, and how does it say it? Now, it's not so much that I'm saying, what did it mean to them? Okay, that's called, the big word for that is exegesis. Exegesis is working out what those words meant for the original readers. We do need to do that, but that's not what I'm talking about here. It's not what do those words mean for us today. That's something else that we have to work out. That's called hermeneutics, the big word. So we're not saying exegesis or hermeneutics at this point. We're simply saying, what does it say, and how does it say it? What is the Greek, but what does the English say? What does the Zulu say? And how is the author saying what he says? Is he saying it sarcastically? Is he saying it angrily? Trying to read between the lines, trying to get into the author's head as you're reading John, as you're reading Peter, as you're reading Paul. How does it say what it says? And so words are really important. If I say, I'm going to finish on this little example, this illustration. If I say to you, if I say that sentence to you, I won't pronounce the words. What comes to mind? Sorry? There's going to be an explosion. Mind the boom. B's thinking about driving a car in the car park, and there's a boom at the end, and be careful it doesn't come down on your roof. There's two words. There's two meanings already, aren't there? How else would we understand that sentence? A bomb blast, an explosion. Yeah, a business boom, eh? Okay. So suddenly, those three little words, mind the boom, there are vastly different meanings, aren't there? Now, we can't all be right, can we? I mean, it's either an explosion, or it's a business boom, or it's something that's going to scratch my car. But it can't be all three at the same time. So it's no good saying, well, you just read the Bible and you decide what it says for you, and that's fine, What it means to you is fine, and what it means to me is fine, although it might be different things. No, you can't do that. When the author wrote those words, he had something in mind, or she, in this case, mind the boom. She was warning us about something, or preparing us for something, but what was in her mind? Okay? And so we need to do some work. So here's a little, okay, some of it hasn't come up, but it should be all right. Here's some examples of how the meaning can change. Firstly, the date could affect the meaning of the word. The date that it was written in. So we need to apply this always to the Bible. The date that Paul wrote this, or that Peter wrote that, is important because of what we know now of history. So if the Mind the Boom was written at 11:59, okay, and my reader is standing next to a cannon on Signal Hill in Cape Town, and it's 11:59, nearly midday, and I say, mind the boom, they're going to do this. Because at 12 o'clock, they fire the cannon. So the context will tell me the meaning. The time that those words were uttered and the place in which they were uttered will give me the meaning. But it's a completely different meaning if the oil price is just about to go through a $100 mark, and I say, mind the boom. You're not going to cover your ears. You're going to grab your cell phone to phone your broker, okay, to sell or to buy or something. Suddenly, because the context has changed, you know exactly what those words mean. And it's completely different. What about if the situation was in a car park and I say, just mind the boom? You know what? You're not going to cover your ears. You're not going to reach for a cell phone, right? You're going to be careful of the boom because it might land on your car. What about this? What about the author? It's the only one we haven't dealt with yet. What if the author or the speaker is Afrikaans? Mind the boom. Now we need to help our English brother. He's talking about a tree. A boom is a tree. So suddenly, because I now know a little bit more about the speaker or the author, the sentence changes again. Completely different now. Means something totally different. Mind the boom. He's saying, careful, you're going to walk into a tree, or you're going to crash your car into a tree or something. But it's got nothing to do with the stock market or cannons going off. And just for a little bit of fun, well, I know some of the ladies have to get going. I don't know if you've seen this boom clip that's on YouTube about someone who didn't watch the boom. Here's an old guy. He wants to get rid of this boom in his garden. So he ties it to his bakkie. He's going to pull it over. He's testing the rope. I don't know if you can see it clearly there. Let me switch this off. He's tied it to the back of his truck. He's busy tightening it up nice and tight. Now he's going to tow it. He's pulling a bit, pulling a bit, pulling a bit. Pull a bit harder, mate. Pull. Now the rope breaks. It's ripped a bit of his bakkie off, but never mind. Now he's tied it again, but tighter this time. There's his bakkie. This happened next door to a friend of mine. This is a canoeing friend of mine. This was his neighbor. Can you believe it? True story. Well, there we go. Mind the boom. He should have minded the boom or done a bit of trigonometry to work out how much space he needed. Okay, we'll leave it there. We'll pick it up next week. Thanks, guys.